marries whom? Even got the grammar right on that one. Who marries whom? Optimal matching and assortative mating. The funny thing about that too is that Becker actually uses another reasonable version of that word, assortive. Kind of reminds me of preventive and preventative, and I think preventive there is actually the one that typically you want to use. So on the agenda today, I thought I'd talk about our schedule, and hopefully I've got all the adjustments and updates. The main one to keep in mind there and flag for you when we look at it is that the optional sections for immigration, which Andrea is going to run, are going to happen not at the end of this week, but next week, if I remember right. I'll talk about learning objectives, and I think that's useful right now, especially with some of the rather difficult material. If you did the reading by Gary Becker for, I think, the 1973 article, if you did it, my hat is off to you. I'm very impressed. It's a very difficult reading. And we'll talk about the learning objectives that you're on the hook for with that most difficult reading by a Nobel laureate. I struggled with it myself. We'll talk about markets and marriage, household production, sorting, and positive and negative sorting. Okay, so here is our remaining calendar up through RRR week, which will be the first full week in May. We'll have several more labs, starting with Lab 9, which is due this Friday, Lab 10 the following Friday, Lab 11 the 24th, and then finally a Lab 13. There is no Lab 12. So it's a busy time. With labs due every Friday, it's probably a good idea to get started on these labs in advance. I understand, I think it was Lab 9 that the GSIs remarked is a fairly straightforward, less difficult lab than some of the other ones. So that's good news anyway. The other good news is that this is going to be it. So once we get through Lab 13, that's the end of the labs. So today we're going to wrap up the topics regarding the economics of marriage and fertility. That's class 18, who marries whom today. And next time we get to start immigration, which I think many of you will find very compelling, perhaps a little bit less close to home than the marriage market stuff, which I think we're all sort of thinking about all the time. But the immigration topic, I think, at least in normal times, is one of the more exciting and interesting ones that touches many of us in a variety of ways. And so we're going to start that on Thursday. Then we'll have several classes on immigration and possibly also in class 23, which I'm planning to hold. So originally we were going to cancel class on the 23rd of April. Instead, we'll do the same thing that we have been doing, and I have to think about what to cover. Then we might have maybe a special class on coronavirus economics or something like that. Might be interesting, or we'll stretch either immigration or the topics of health and mortality that we wind up the class with. So we don't have a ton of time left, and then it'll be RRR week. Are there any questions on the remaining schedule? Feel free to use raise my hand or use the chat. Class on COVID-19 would be interesting. Yeah, I'll see what I can do. Time is, as you know, of course, time is quite precious for everybody. And it was a challenge for me just to get the slides together. The slides are available now, but they weren't not until about 12:15 or so. And I apologize for the late date. So I agree that talking more about COVID-19 and the health and economic impacts would be quite interesting, and maybe we can do that. The good news is that some of the faculty who are not teaching this class anymore, either because they are retired or because they have this term off from teaching, have actually been working on an interesting examination of COVID-19 and the aggregate impacts on the mortality side and what we can say about that. So perhaps they'd let me borrow some of their material to talk about. I think that might be very interesting. Okay, so there's the course calendar. Let's talk about the remaining requirements. We've got the labs. There is no lab 12. And then the final exam, we have not started to prepare it, but I'm pretty sure that it will be fully electronic, probably on B courses, and it probably will be 100% multiple choice, maybe some true or false. It'll be timed with extra time as usual for DSP allowances. It'll be open book, open note, open everything, but you're on your honor that it's you and that you're working on your own and no collaboration. So we'll have an honor code part of that as before, but it will be, it'll be timed in a more streamlined way, and you won't be responsible for uploading something, which I know was a problem for some of you at the midterm. So that's the current plan. Questions about that? Okay. So I thought I'd cover the learning objectives in broad strokes here, the big things that you need to be taking away from this part of the course. And it would be nice to also be interested in some of these topics, and hopefully I've made them engaging. I regret it's been quite a struggle for me, I think, as it has been for all of you as well, to maintain your focus, but also to prepare for class. And you know, this is compelling stuff. The immigration topics are also compelling as well. I hope that in office hours and in class, we can make these as compelling as we can, but sometimes time constraints limit what we can do, and I regret that. And I wish there were more time to do cool things with this. So the learning objectives in the economics of fertility include things like the value of time model. That's a really big one. And it's big because we think that this really mattered a lot for historical fertility changes. And the story is about women's wages and how they rose with female education, with the declines of stigma and for women in the workplace. And that feeds directly into the total cost of children. And that's the model. Income and substitution effects are part of that. And income and substitution effects more broadly, of course, apply with any model that has a relative price in it. There's a version, for example, of the optimal retirement system model that we saw right before the midterm that has income and substitution effects in addition. And so we might do something like that on the final exam, where you might have to apply the concepts of income and substitution effects to something other than the model of labor supply and wages. And that would be fair game. And if you're feeling uncomfortable about income and substitution effects, you're not alone. It's a very hard topic, and I know Katya covered them in section. We continue to cover them in office hours. And if you're uncomfortable with it, cover them and cover them more, and come to office hours, ask us questions and ask us to go over them with you, because it becomes clearer with repetition. The quality quantity trade-off, and there I think I probably should have made the point that understanding what we mean when we say child quality, which is I think perhaps an unfortunately chosen term, because you know all children have quality. What we mean is that the investment into the child, whether it's the amount of time spent by the parents, or the quality of clothing, or of nutritious food, or of education, all of those things cost money. And when you spend more in terms of the quality inputs, whether it's college or fancy new clothes or really high protein food or high nutritional value food, whatever it is, it's clear that your budget gets constrained more. And the point there is just that if you have a whole bunch of kids, you can't provide a high quality investment for each one of them without breaking your budget and getting more cash somewhere. So that's the trade-off, basically, is the financial one. And then there's also probably a trade-off in terms of people's preferences, whether they would prefer to have lots of children or a few children is part of the story. Together then, these perspectives give you what I called substitution effects on caffeine. It's pushing choice toward the quality of children, meaning toward education. And we see that in just about every country in the world, except maybe where the demographic transition hasn't yet sort of fully taken effect. In the economics of marriage and divorce, the takeaways there are things like this. In the classic view from Gary Becker, marriage happens because there are gains from specialization, from partnership-specific goods and investments, things that require there to be some kind of a long-standing bond or covenant or something. And so that's the whole point of of a marriage. It's different from having a roommate, because typically with roommates, you don't take vows in front of your families to do something for at least a little while. With a roommate, it's much more, you know, this works for me and then I'm out of here. And that's fine, but it probably means that you are less likely to maintain long-term investments, or undertake them, I should say, because, you know, the relationship may be fleeting. So that's a pretty important perspective there. And I think the investment part of it makes a lot of sense to most people. I think the thing that may not make much sense are the gains from specialization. And there, if they don't make sense to you, try to think about how, if you do have a roommate, for example, you probably don't do exactly the same tasks in your shared environment, but maybe you do. I don't know. I'm not, it's been so long since I've done that, I can't remember. I think when I had roommates, we probably never cleaned the place. And so we didn't have this problem of trying to figure out who would be on the hook for cleaning it, whether you'd specialize and have one person cleaning and another person, say, buying the groceries or something like that. So it describes perhaps a bygone era, but some of the salient points are still relevant, which is that when you have a partnership, it doesn't make perfect sense usually for everybody to just be duplicating activities. It makes a lot of sense for somebody to take the task on of taking the kids to the grocery store during normal non-coronavirus times. One of the members of the household taking the kids to the park or the playground, while the other one maybe does the dishes or something like that. Of course, the great magic is that in this day and age, we do have many robots in the household that actually, lead us to abstract from these roles. That, it doesn't take a ton. You still have to load the dishwasher and empty it, unfortunately. And perhaps at some point we'll have a robot that actually does that. Other topics here in this part of the course then are divorce, and we'll talk about that more in a couple of slides here. And that is part of the sort of new view, I would say. The Stevenson and Wolfer's reading is the new view. The Becker reading is the old stuff, and we need to be able to master both and talk about both with some degree of specificity. And we'll also talk about similarity in tastes and enjoyment of life, and that is not something that really enters Becker's models a ton. Finally, then the last topic that we'll touch on today is assortative or assortive mating. They mean the same thing, and the usage just varies a little bit. Becker writes assortive, it means exactly the same thing. Marriage and fertility are choices. It's interesting to compare how traits typically vary within couples, and how there can be positive assortive mating where you see similar traits with a positive correlation across couples. Negative assortive mating usually means that there's a combination of very different types. And so that's fun to look at in data and to think about what it means. Okay, so we ended last class just about to talk about some topics in divorce, and I just wanted to cover them here. I'm not going to go over the slides that we didn't look at last time, which I think are fairly self-evident. I wanted to instead include some slides here that are drawn more directly from the Stevenson and Wolfer's reading that I think are useful. So we've got a theory of marriage. Why do people divorce? Well, if there are gains to marriage, then there probably are also gains to divorce if people actually do it. And you could think about it as some kind of challenge for people to think about over long periods of time, that you might want to marry, or if you are married, you might want to get divorced if the benefits of a divorce minus the current cost of divorce exceeds the current gains to the marriage. And that's of course true in reverse. Then if you thought about why keep a marriage going, you could just kind of flip the signs and all that. And so that's one way of viewing this, that maybe a marriage ends up meaning less than you thought it might. There's a lot of uncertainty, as anybody in a long-term partnership or marriage or any kind of relationship will tell you. Once you get involved, things change. Life changes. Coronavirus has hit. All kinds of things happen. And you may find that the calculation of benefits of the union is changing over time. And so that's the point. So the state then of the marriage market is important. That's another issue here. And if the marriage market then doesn't look as good as it did when you got in, that might be a motivation to stay in a marriage. And I don't have a ton to say about this because I think there are ways in which this is changing a lot over time, and with new technologies of matching people up across many different ages, where it used to be the case that you didn't have a ton of opportunities to find different people in the marriage market outside, say, of high school and college, and and then it might take a heck of a lot of work afterward. And of course, these days we all do it. Well, I'm guessing that we all do it with our cell phones. I think you all have much better knowledge about that than I do. I'm an oldster and have been partnered up now for almost 20 years, if you count it from when we met. So I honestly don't really know. So these are part of the calculation, obviously. To what extent can you get back into a union if you ditch the one that you're currently in, sort of matters quite a bit. And I suspect, and so this is terrain that I have not tread, but I imagine the sociologists probably have a ton of very informative and interesting things to say about markets for partnership now that it's a lot more costless to start a new one with online dating, if you want to call it that, or online hookups or something. And so that obviously affects it, lowers the cost really of divorcing or stopping a relationship. So over a life cycle, of course, careers can develop in unexpected ways or be lost. And sometimes the best laid plans, when you get into it, can end up being inadequate. People change psychologically over life. It also is true that people tend to grow more alike, I think, especially through common shared experiences. And when you think about when the union began, the partners may not have been the most honest. You would think that you're not going to get ahead by through deception alone here, but certainly that's part of the calculation here. And one would imagine that's part of what a divorce rate reflects, is people realizing exactly what was the difference between an honest take or an honest selling of oneself versus something that was sort of more objectively true. Let's just leave that there and move on. Okay. Is divorce bad? Is marriage good? So I wanted to say this and have a slide about this point because there are a lot of very smart folks in social sciences who say things like, in a blanket sense, marriage is good. We should design policies that increase marriage. And I think there's a lot to that, but I also think that it isn't obviously always true that marriage is always good. And that's a point that Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers make here. And it's one that when you take an economic perspective, one ought to keep in mind. There are a lot of unobservable characteristics. Marriage and divorce are not randomly applied. And there's a reason that you see people who are married and stay married. And there's a reason you see people who are getting divorced. They're not the same people. So it's not as if, divorce is some kind of a natural calamity like a coronavirus or like a forest fire that just touches people. There are situations in which perhaps that might have happened if there's, for example, an economic collapse that claims people's jobs, and that creates a lot of mental health trauma, and maybe that results in partnerships that wither and deteriorate. That's certainly possible. Of course, then one wonders, well, what would a policy look like that could actually maintain the marriage? And it probably would be replacing the job or the income. So, what we're saying is there are a lot of things that go into the state of being married, and it's not too obvious that policy should, say, reduce the price of marriage to try to encourage it, because it's an endogenous thing. It reflects people making choices. So here are several quotes that they toss in there about this. That there's evidence that divorce tends to make people less happy in the year that they separate, but then down the road they end up being happier than when they were married. So maybe a divorce was a good thing for the people who have chosen the divorce. That's the other part of all this. There's another point down here at the bottom then about how perhaps less marriage might be good under certain circumstances. And so a study that looked at state laws that raise the minimum age of marriage and finds that it's possible to be too young to marry and have sort of a lasting relationship there. And that's probably something that is deeply resonating with all of us. There's a reason why our parents suggest that we, hold off a little bit and maybe go to college and then maybe get married, but not too late, right? That's what the parents usually say. It's probably not real great to get married at age 15 or 16, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. So it's sort of one extreme end of everything, but it's a valid point. So that's the economics perspective on things, is that people are choosing these things for a reason. So it's not always too clear that, in fact, marriage is always good and divorce is always bad. I think you could step back and say, well, for kids, it probably is pretty much always bad, I guess, for your parents to get divorced, unless they were miserable and they become happier and that helps you ultimately. I don't know. It's really hard to tell. Most of the slide is all about the perspective from the view of the couple themselves, which is a little bit cleaner, I guess, and it's tougher to say when we're talking about kids. So let's talk about assortative mating. I couldn't resist tossing this in here, which I have seen this movie, and maybe you have as well, The Fiddler on the Roof, but it's been quite a while. We, of course, love musicals in our household, like many of you probably do as well. And it turns out that a fairly big part of this movie was all about the matchmaking. And Tevye is Jewish, and he's interested in maintaining the Jewish tradition. And so that's what they talk about a lot. Marriages, of course, can either maintain or continue traditions, or they can change them. And so that's kind of the big part of the story there. I think. I can't remember too well because I haven't seen it in a while. So let's put some numbers up here, since we're economists and we have to do that rather than just waving our hands. So this one's funny, to think about an example of marrying or not marrying when here are the people involved. Here's somebody named Suzanne, and she's got two payoffs in this little matrix over here. Suzanne alone produces 10 units. That's her green production. Suzanne, when she's married to David, who's this person over here in the red, produces only 8. So apparently David is a net drag on her production. And how does one reconcile that when we're about to say that production, of course, is a lot of things. It could be, the dollars produced with your labor, but in terms of marital production and the way Becker talks about it, it usually is a broader concept of total well-being measured in some way. Economists always like to change everything into dollars, of course, but the idea would be that it's not just, say, Suzanne's labor market production, it's also her happiness. And apparently it's not good to get married to David because it goes down. So this is sort of an extreme example. And what does it mean to have output, and how do you share it and all that? Here's David, who alone is really poorly off. He's only got 2. And then if he's married to Suzanne, he's got 6. So the questions to ask here then are, under what circumstances would Suzanne and David marry? You might imagine, well, suppose they keep what they produce. There's no sharing, no trading, no bargaining, etc. It seems pretty clear that Suzanne probably wouldn't get married because somehow her production goes down. That David is destructive for her in that sense, which isn't great. But if you think about the alternative in which, by being married, they are sharing and could sell their services or effectively give them to one another, they pool them, I think is what we're imagining here. Then the sum of them when married is 8 plus 6 or 14, rather than the sum when they are alone, which is 12, 10 plus 2. And so if you actually share, then maybe you would get married. So Professor Goldstein came up with these numbers, and it would be interesting to talk to him and understand why he selected the ones that he did, because it has a rather bleak view of marriage. I'd be interested to hear if the GSIs remember what he said last year. The chat's very funny. I do love reading the chat, and I'll go ahead and save the chat and post it because it's a lot of fun. So what are the lessons to draw here? Well, for marriage to make sense, nobody needs to be worse off. That's sort of obvious there. And you might say modern marriage, right? That, you know, perhaps there were marriages in the past where somebody might be worse off after the marriage, but maybe that, you know, that somebody didn't have any social power or market power. That's certainly possible, but the models of marriage that we're thinking about today are ones in which people enter and exit relatively freely, especially in the United States, where sort of there are a lot of marriages and there are a lot of divorces as well. If there's trade and bargaining, then you would expect to see an arrangement with the highest output should be the choice, because you can divide up the spoils so that everybody wins. Now, the subtle thing, and what I wrestled with for some time, and part of the reason why I posted the slides so darn late today, is that Becker in the 1973 reading points out this inconvenient truth that makes the math much harder than this previous example here. And that is that there's what is produced by each of these people, and then you can think about the sum of these, and that would be kind of the total marriage output, which is some concept that makes sense. But there's no reason why it has to be split 50-50. So Becker's point was that, in fact, there can be these arrangements within units in the marriage market, within, you know, and across these individuals. And so, for example, David could make the pitch here to Suzanne. He'll say, look, I'll give you 3 of my units. I'm making 6. I'll give you 3. You're better off than you would have been. And then that means Suzanne doesn't have to be, you know, magnanimous here. So that was the kind of the extra special thing that showed up, and it will show up here in the slides, and it also showed up in Becker's point. You could think about it as being a maximizing of the total marital output, but the subtle point is much more challenging to get one's head around. And it's also not something we're going to ask you on the exam, but the subtle point is that there can be these arrangements within the union that provide the incentive to be in that particular unit, not to deviate, and it ends up actually getting you a situation where the total marriage market maximizes the total output in this magical way. And so that was the thing that Becker had in mind. Okay. So again, there's a lot of math. If you read the Becker reading, congratulations. I skimmed it myself. It's compelling in the way that a Nobel laureate's paper from 1973 is compelling. It's dense. It also had broad reach. If you're familiar with George Akerlof's paper on the market for lemons, so that also had broad reach, and it is a hard read because of the time period in which it was written. So let me just kind of touch on the bird's eye points here. That there's a household production function, and that's uppercase Z, which is some function H of these 2 inputs here, of the attributes of these 2 people. So that's okay. It's a kind of like a utility function, if you like, but the point is it's household production. What is exactly production? Well, it's money stuff, but it's not just that. It's also things like happiness and enjoyment of kids, a lot of things that are not in GDP. And that was, at the time, a very novel way of looking at things. If you like, it's a way of integrating things that are beyond, obviously, sort of first tier economics, things that are, oh yes, let me click on Nicole, who raised a hand. Sorry, I think I...
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
So is this the production that you were referring to in the previous slide with Suzanne and David?
Yes, that's what we're trying to get at here, that it's not just you know, dollars of production. It's not just labor market stuff. It's also happiness or enjoyment, a lot of things that are difficult to measure. That's right.
Does it also include like household production, as we mentioned in previous lectures, like vacuuming and like doing laundry and such?
Yeah, I think it would. I think it would. I'm trying to think about what are the implications of kind of these different definitions of it. And I think that, you know, the learning objective here is just, it's a broad definition. That's the point. And I'm trying to think about if it matters a ton exactly what it involves. And I don't think it does. I think it just has to be broad.
Thank you.
Thanks. That's a really good question. Yeah. So it's a broad measure of production and of well-being. And I guess the thing about this, how would you operationalize this? And you'll be doing this in lab 10, if I remember the numbers right. You could look at data on spouses, on people in partnerships, and try to understand why they're making the decisions that they are. I mean, the part of the problem is that a lot of these things, since we're making this point, it's a broad measure, a broad definition of output. It's not just cash brought into the household. So maybe that's the point, that when you're thinking about the reasons why people become married, it's not going to be that easy to just measure it in a survey where you ask people what their earnings are. It's going to be a lot of different sorts of things. And I think, that matches reality. It also, of course, is a bit unfortunate for actually conducting empirical research, but I guess it makes us check ourselves a little bit about, what we hope to say and how complicated the model has to be to actually capture something that we care about. So another point to say here is that in the lab, what you're going to be doing is looking at same-sex couples in the American Community Survey, which it's cool that we can do that now because the Census Bureau changed the nature of the questions and the way that things were coded so that one can actually assess this. And you might be interested in the well-being of same-sex couples, for example. There's a whole awesome set of research questions about that. I remember having a brown bag speaker some time ago at the demography department who discussed all that. You might be interested in the marriage market outcomes of, say, Latinos and Hispanics or African Americans. If any group that's identifiable, you might be interested in Jewish Americans. You might be interested in Muslim Americans or something. And you can do a lot of that with data that we have. I'm not so sure about the religion stuff. I think you might have to use something like the General Social Survey. But the point is that, there are lots of things that go into this. One of them is the degree to which you create happiness. And you can get at that with some kinds of survey questions, especially in rich surveys, but it's going to be missed if you just look at the cash. Okay, so let's look a little bit at these models of optimal sorting. And I struggled with this for a long time. The learning objectives here are, you can write down some game theory and you can come up with some predictions. For C175, what I want you to focus on is that it's possible to think about the marriage choices in this way of optimizing marital production, of optimizing your well-being. That's sort of obvious, right? And also, it's pretty obvious that people probably behave strategically in the marriage market. Now, the drawbacks, though, I think are pretty big here. So here in my first point, we're assuming full information that there's no surprises about household production, meaning your happiness and your well-being, in addition to how much money you are able to make together, how many children you can make together, and things like that. And that's just preposterous, right? It's the stupidest thing ever to think that you know this all in advance. You don't. There's a lot of faith, and of course you might say that's part of the reason why marriages many times, not always, are somewhat linked to religion. You kind of have to have faith here. So when Becker does his nifty models, and it's in the 1970s economics that is worthy of a Nobel Prize for sure. It opened a lot of eyes, but it's also formal, rigorous in its formality, but it's limited because of this point. And there's a way to, of course, work around this. And I had mentioned a while ago that George Akerlof, who incidentally is an emeritus professor of economics at UC Berkeley, and he's married to the great Janet Yellen, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve for, I think, 4 years, and overlapped a little bit with Trump. And then now she is also retired. And she's an emerita professor at UC Berkeley too, I believe. And George Akerlof wrote about the market for lemons, where there's imperfect information. And one of the points there is that the market for used cars can really break down if there are a lot of lemons. In other words, you have information that you don't have information about the cars out there. Same thing could happen in a marriage market. If you're aware that there are a lot of charlatans, this would be a fun word to use, people who sort of obscure who they really are. that could lead to a breakdown in the marriage market, for example. And Becker doesn't have anything to say about that per se. He is modeling something where there's perfect information. Okay, so we're going to keep it simple here. The real world, you've got limited information. Keeping it simple is still useful. It reveals something, and that is that that you might find a result when a match is made if no alternative is better, and that makes a lot of sense, I guess. I don't know. I'm sure it does. It's a painful thing sometimes to think about it. Well, okay, what happened in the romantic market, and how did people sort of shift their choices and all that? It does happen, right? Okay. So a better match occurs if shifting to a different partner gets you a better outcome. Okay, so this is hard. Gary Becker was a Nobel laureate for a reason, and there are many, many layers of this onion. And when I was putting together the slides here, I seem to have found an error in the slides from last spring. And something this hard won't be on the exam, I promise. Something more attainable might be on the exam, and it would be along the lines of, here's a marriage market. Why do people get married? And the point is that they're in it to win it. They're in it to maximize their well-being. That's the economics perspective. And we'll keep it simple like that. Okay, so here's an example that actually shows up in the reading in Becker's example. And you have to read the fine print to really see what's going on. What was wrong in the slide last year was that the males and females here were reversed. And that just took me the longest time to figure out what in the world was going on, because it didn't make any sense until finally I understood that the columns and rows were all reversed. Okay, so suppose this is the payoff matrix. And so these are units of this aggregate composite of marital production, which means all kinds of well-being. It's your happiness, it's your income level. You could think about it as being indexed by happiness, which in principle you would imagine ought to be a function of all kinds of things: your income, your wealth, your social standing, the size of the house you have, which I guess is wealth, but your number of kids, the number of bridge games you win with your partner against your your competing partner friends, etc. So supposing these are the trade-offs, what does this mean? Well, so here's a female number one. Suppose female number one marries male number one, then their total marital production is 8. Suppose female number one marries male number 2, their total production would be 9. And that's what I think draws the eye here. Here's female number 2, male number 1, their union would produce 4 if they got married, and then female 2 and male 2 would produce 7. And the point is then that there are these pair-offs, so people can't pair with multiple people, and we're also assuming that you have to do opposite sex in this example. And it would get complicated, but it'd be interesting to think about what would happen, say, if F1 and F2 could get together, or M1 and M2, but we're assuming that that's not happening. And so here then I'll box off the two sort of different states of the world. So either we've got the red circles where F1 and M1 are paired up here and they're producing 8, or F2 and M2 are paired up and they're producing 7. Or the alternate world, in which the square world, in which F1 and M2 instead are paired up and they're producing 9, and F2 and M1 are paired up and they're producing 4. So which one should be chosen? And there are at least 2 layers of this onion here. If you thought about the green squares and the total output within the marital union, probably the green ones are where you would end up, I think. And so how to think about that? Well, suppose F1 is paired up with M2. From F1's perspective, the female's perspective here, would she prefer to switch and go to M1? No, if they're splitting things equally, because that would reduce the total marital surplus. What about the choice of M2? Would M2 like to switch from F1 to F2, so switch from this green box over to the red circle? Well, no, it's a reduction again from 9 to 7. Now, would M1 and F2 like to switch? Yeah, but the problem is they would have to get one of the others to agree to it. F1 and M2, getting their 9 units here, are in the driver's seat. And so my point here is that there's some major hosing going on here. if you ended up in the green box world, F1 and M2 are sitting pretty, they're earning their 9, and F2 and M1 are not, and that's not great. So the layer of the onion then next is this point that Becker whips out, which is a very hard thing to kind of get your head around here. Let me show you what I've done. On the previous slide, here's 8 in this union, and here's 3 plus 5, which equals 8. What this is a divvying up of the returns between the two members of this couple. And down here, here's 5 plus 2, and that's equal to 7. So Becker talks about this, and what he says is that if the female and the male manage to split these returns within the union in this unequal way, they can produce an equilibrium in which both couples will agree to operate in the red circle world here and not in the green square world. And by the way, so I'm kind of jumping around here and I'll come back and make this clear in a second. And by the way, so what happens then, if you get into the red circle world, the total is 8 plus 7 or 15 units. That's a maximum total output. The green square world is 9 plus 4, which is 13. So I apologize for how oniony this is. If it makes you cry, that's what onions do. This is challenging. Gary Becker was a Nobel laureate for a reason, and he pointed this out, that if underneath it all, the couples managed to split up the returns here. So how does this work? The left one is the male's return of 3 units. The right one is the female's return of 5 units. So let's think about M2. The male is getting 5 units here, and the M2 will not switch over to marrying F1 because F1 is earning 5 in the gold here, and M2 is earning 5 in the gold in these arrangements, in the red circle marriages. So 10 units is greater than what they would earn together in 9 in the green. So that's a very, very subtle point. There's a way within these marriages, and it just sounds preposterous, right? There's a way within these marriages for the male and the female to divvy up their returns in an unequal fashion that makes it so that M2 won't switch and F1 won't switch. And it's also true that M1 and F2 won't switch, the other two in the dyad here. And the reason is they are not going to switch into this range here. M won't marry F2 because the total is less than what they get separately. The male here, M1 getting 3 currently in the red circle, and F2 getting 2 in this red circle. That's 5 units, and that's greater than what they would get together if they switched. So let me pause there and let that sink in a little bit. Take a drink break. Yes, let me click on Nicole again, who's raising her hand. Can you hear me, or go ahead, Nicole?
Yes, I put my question in the chat, but it says that M2 won't marry F1 because like the sum, the 10 is greater, but is that because M2 is considering like the total amount, whereas in like a typical prisoner's dilemma, each agent is like putting their own interest first?
I think that's exactly a big part of it here. I think Nicole's saying that you're considering the total amount, and that's a little different than the usual game theory or the prisoner's dilemma where you're considering your individual payoff. I think that's right, and that's kind of why the math gets very interesting here with these different components that are separated between the male and the female pieces of each of these unions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Okay. So that's what's going on in this example in Becker. And I think the learning objectives then are, and here's at the bottom of this slide. Becker's point was that private contracts can actually get us to the total output maximizing situation here. So the red circle world and not the green square world. In the red circle world, the total across both of these couples is 15 units. And in the green square world, it's 13, which is less. So what he's saying is that with full information, right? So each one of these couples understands what the payoffs are, and they can write these contracts of divvying up the within marriage returns in this way, excuse me, and they can somehow enforce them. They can somehow enforce the contracts. So if you make all the standard assumptions in economics that get made about having contracts, having perfect information, knowledge, trust, enforcing contracts, then what happens is there's a rather unequal distribution of these resources here. It's the M1 is taking it on the chin, if you will, or taking the short end of the stick, giving more of the marital output to F1 to stick with him, and the reverse is happening here. So M2 is getting more of the marital output here, giving less to the female. So F2 in some sense is only getting these 2 units, and that's really a shame. And it works. Yeah, there's probably some interesting deeper point, and of course, maybe a very tragic deeper point about, you know, within couple inequality and bargaining power. I guess you could say that you know, underneath the numbers here probably is a statement about the, if you like, bargaining power or the marriageability of these different individuals on the marriage market, and what the sort of full complete market's private outcomes are for these different individuals. Is this realistic? Well, they're within each dyad, right? If you think about all your couple friends, every one of them is a little bit different, but at the same time, there also is a lot of similarity too. And I'm not, you know, this is a very sort of cold calculation economics perspective on things. And I guess the trick is to try to abstract from it and take away things that are more broadly true, that are less kind of money grubbing and self-centered. But, you know, at the bottom line, of course, Becker's trying to say that, look, this is a very optimistic point, that you end up with the socially optimal outcome here. The total in the red circles is 15. The total in the green is 13. So it's socially optimal for these couples to get together in the red circles, even though it looks like if they could, and if they were splitting the outcomes 50-50, the green squares would be the outcome. And you know, this couple F1 M2 then would be kind of the, you know, the royal couple, and would be so much better off than the other couple. And as a whole, society wouldn't be as well off. But with these contracts, you could end up getting this equilibrium, the red circle one. Okay. Other questions before we talk a little bit more about the characteristics of a good match and other things? Dan, yeah, let me click on Dan Ma. Go ahead.
Can you explain, like, I'm still confused between the difference between the 5+5 and the like the purple and the yellow numbers. What do they mean?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah, it's hard. The notation is not great, is it? These are the returns that are given to the male. That's the first number in each of these cases. And I apologize, I should probably annotate the slide a little bit better. So the first number is the amount given to the male in the couple. So here it happens to be the M1 person gets 3 units. The male in this couple gets 5 units. The reason they share a color, which is different then, it's because we're talking about the choices of the female and the male in these prospective couples. So M2 won't marry F1. So here's M2, who thinks about his 5, won't marry F1, who thinks about her 5. So it's colored gold. And the reason is that 5 + 5 is 10, which is greater than what they could get together, which is this number 9. So that was a really good question. Did I answer it okay?
I'm kind of still confused. Like, can you like repeat that, but for the purple numbers again?
Sure. For the purple number, so here, this 3 is being given to M1, the male, in this couple. And the 2 is given to this female, F2, in this couple. So F2 and M1 are not going to get together, and they'd end up over here in this green box. And the reason they won't is because 3 plus 2 is greater than 4.
Okay.
Yeah. This is hard stuff. I struggled with it a bunch of this morning. So I had not seen this myself. It's buried in a paper by a Nobel laureate from 1973. So this is hard, and I think it's useful to go over it in part because it cements a positive message that Becker is saying here, which is that, and this is a very universal message about that economics has, is that private actors can figure out ways of making things good. And the surprising thing then is, even if the marital surplus, I keep saying surplus, the marital production is actually highest within this couple, there's a way for these enterprising people to actually figure out ways of divvying up the returns to incentivize the thing that is socially optimal, which is this outcome, the red circles. Okay, I thought, did Nicole have her hand up again? Do you want to put it down?
Yes, sorry. I was trying to form my question and understanding, because you were saying that like 5 plus 5, that's 10, which is greater than 9. But why do they then just like give up on F1? Like, I mean, is the 5 plus 5 like a hypothetical, like it would never occur?
Well, that's a really good question. It's the distribution of the gains within the marriage. So in the red circle marriage, in this one here, 3 plus 5, the 5 is given to the female number 1. So it's not hypothetical, it's what's actually happening in this marriage. The male and the female both agree that she gets 5, he gets 3, and the total of it is 8. And down here, M2 and F2 are both agreeing that he gets 5 and she gets only 2. So she's the least well off individually here, if one doesn't. And I think one's assuming here that we're not actually sharing, that in fact M2 is getting the lion's share, but so is F1 at least, I guess.
But from like M2's perspective, does it choose F2 because it personally gets 5 versus 3?
Yes, it personally gets 5, and together, so M2 sees that together, if it went with F1, it would only have 9 to split between it and F1. And F1's currently getting the 5 in this union, and M2's getting the 5 in that union. So it's a tough thing here. In their red circle marriages, they're getting a total of 10. If they went to the green square marriage, they would get a total of 9. I feel like we should have like a scorecard. So maybe after class today, what I'll do is I'll write up the narrative a little bit better. Again, it's the big picture that we end up in the socially optimal situation here because of individuals making these contracts. I think the thing that he doesn't go into, of course, is that what about poor F2 who gets only 2 units here, but well, otherwise she might be stuck in the green world and already divvying up her 4 between M1 and herself and still just getting 2. So maybe even there somebody is still gain or not losing, right? She's not gaining, but she's not losing. Yeah, not fun to be F2. Okay. So should we move on? Again, that's Becker on steroids. That's the real Becker, right? That's straight into the vein. And like I said, I struggled with it today because I had not seen this. I hadn't read the paper in many years, if ever. So if you don't get it, the takeaways, are not the granular stuff that will take some time to really cement in your head. It took me a long time. The big takeaways are that in a marriage market that functions with private contracts and full information, In fact, there will be sorting that ends up being socially optimal, and it also ends up being individually optimal too. I guess that's the other thing that we didn't go into great detail about, but it turns out that this is also the maximum for each of these individuals. I kind of hinted at that with what happens to poor F2, that, you know, she doesn't gain any, she doesn't also lose any. She ends up, you know, originally, if you're in the green square world, she'd split the 4. And now she's getting 2, which is the same. The other thing too, you know, one could say, well, you don't have to get married. And the payoffs here, of course, don't reflect that choice. We're assuming that everybody does. Okay. So having blown everybody's mind and ruined everybody's day with that, I blame Professor Goldstein, actually. He's ruined my day with that too. You know, it's fun to think about all this. And again, the takeaways are that, you know, people are crafty. That's probably true in some deep sense. But the other thing, of course, is that there are a lot of parts of the marriage market that seem like maybe they don't function that well. And is there a scope for policy? I think economists would say it's not obvious, but that doesn't mean it's not worth asking the question, how to make life easier for married people, because we think that marriage also seems to be associated with a lot of really good things. Okay, let's move ahead. What drives a good match? Thinking about traits across partners, and that's what Lab 10 will ask you to look at. Some traits are probably complementary. Some other traits are probably more like substitutes. I think the way I tend to view this is more that, you know, the complementary traits seem like they kind of win the day, really. But it doesn't mean that there aren't senses in which things are substitutes, that you know, opposites attract is kind of where that path leads you. And I think anybody in a partnership would admit, yeah, sure, there are a lot of things that we have in common, me and my partner, but we also have things that are not the same, and that's also important. So you could say, well, you know, if you're high education, you enjoy talking politics and science and being on Twitter or something. And if you're low education, you don't enjoy that. You enjoy other things like maybe being on Twitter. Maybe it's the same thing. And maybe some traits are substitutes. So what is interesting here is to look at the data and try to see about how things are correlated or not, which suggests something about how they are either complementary or substitutes for one another. One of the things that I think is surprising, perhaps not given the era in which he was writing, was that Becker actually thinks that wage levels maybe are substitutes there. And so what he points out is that if you see a negative correlation between WM and WF, and there it's a female and a male in a traditional male-female dyad. There's a wage of the male and a wage of the female. If there's a negative correlation there, then his point is you would be maximizing total output because you gain most from the division of labor. So a low-wage females would spend more time in household production, and that would also be true if you switch those gender roles. And so if the low-wage man were married to a high-wage woman, the low-wage man should spend more time in household production, for example. So it goes both ways. He's not just saying a story about women staying home and doing household production there, but he's saying that this seems like it ought to make a lot of sense. And okay, that's one view of it all. But I guess what is, and I think what's going to be kind of emerging and maybe not that surprising, is that sure, there are some couples where that seems to be the case. And there are a heck of a lot where it doesn't seem to be the case at all, that in fact you have similar groups associating and becoming married, and they might have very similar wages. So the real world then will be, you can view it in the 2015 American Community Survey, which is a large scale micro census of about 1% of the population. It's been going on since 2005 was the first public data release, I think, and it was also happening in trial stages after the 2000 census. We'll look just at California, and you'll look at same-sex marriages, and if we have time, perhaps we'll look at the data and examine opposite-sex marriages there too. We'll have to see how that all goes. So the idea is that it's interesting to look at the characteristics of people within marriages and see how they vary. And you can kind of, you can take it from there. There's a whole set of literatures that assess this and try to get a sense of how families are evolving, what seems to be important to families, to partnerships, that sort of thing. So that's coming up. Okay, to summarize then, so there can be a production function for households. If you have a free market of choosing partners and also striking contracts within the household, that's, I think, the very subtle point that Becker makes. And as we saw, that, you know, struggling with the example can make our heads swim. The point is that you've got a free market also within a household in striking a particular contract. And that appears, if you've got full information, to maximize individual and also social welfare, which is a remarkable thing. Free markets. I mean, you know, that's Econ 101, right? It's free markets are good. Okay, sure, if you've got full information, enforceable contracts and property rights, but of course, a lot of bad things can happen when any of those things are not around. So a framework then for understanding sorting and how people are doing it, but not necessarily predictive. Let me just pause there before I do the last topic today and ask if there are any questions. Okay, so the last topic was a shameless self-plug. So this was a paper that my co-author and I published back in 2010, and I still remember the day that Jennifer Roth poked her head into my office and she said, "Can you believe what is being written about?" And it was that in the medical literature, you'll find a thread that suggests, and not without some reason, that advanced paternal age, so the age of the dad, can be bad for children's test scores, neurocognitive outcomes. So the older you are as a dad, the worse off your kids are. That's the perspective here. And so, you know, she she pointed this out and said, "Oh, come on." And I said, "You're right." I said, "Oh, come on." And so we wrote this paper, and this was back when I was at Queens College. And it was a lot of fun to write this. I'm not sure we made too many friends by writing this paper, because what we basically said in the paper was, "Oh, come on," and you'll see why. So let me just delve into it. Again, what's useful is just to read the title of the paper. It reveals the punchline. Negative effects of paternal age on children's neurocognitive outcomes can be explained by maternal education and number of siblings. Another way of saying that is, it's silly to say that advanced paternal age is a real deal breaker for children's well-being. There's something to it, but our point was basically you can explain all this with maternal education, with number of siblings, and so we'll talk about that. How is it related here? Well, it's this issue of how do families form? How do couples form partnerships, and whom do they choose? So I think part of the reason this was kind of, you know, a sexy topic in the literature at least 10 years ago, and I don't know where we are anymore, is that it was part of the maybe a biological clock for males. And there is most definitely one for females, but arguably there also is one for males through this kind of mechanism. The longer you are on the earth, the more, you know, solar radiation, et cetera, that you expose yourself to and other pathogens, there can be mutations to sperm for the male. This is also true about the female contribution, but it's less salient because there are other things that are more salient about the female contribution to reproduction. And famously, if you remember who this is, and if you don't, that's perfectly fine, but a guy named Hugh Hefner was unable to produce children toward the end of his life, and he'd gotten married probably. He finally did get married, but of course, for many years he wasn't. I think he finally got married maybe twice or three times, but had this whole having children thing was important, and famously he was unable to do that. And the thing is, you get old enough and sometimes things sort of wear out. Sample sizes are small. There is some science here, and the story is that, for example, schizophrenia may be associated with older dads because of a particular kind of mutation or heredity. So it's not that this is totally silly. It's just that it's maybe more hype than probably it should be. And so you might ask yourself, well, how would you ever test for this? Well, would you just randomly assign older dads to moms and kids? Of course not. You can't do that. Maybe there was a time and a place, I don't know, but you can't. So what you can do is measure outcomes among kids, say at some standard age or grade level, like kids in kindergarten. So suppose you're measuring everybody at, say, age 5 or age 6. You could do that. You could look at all kids in kindergarten who have older dads. But the problem is that you quickly realize there's a reason they have older dads. It's not completely random. There's a sort of mating that's going on. There's another sort of more straightforward thing here too, that kids might have had older dads because they already had a ton of older siblings. So if you're the youngest in a big family, you kind of have to have an older dad because dad had to get started and mom had to get started at some point, but they've gone and they're just doing the business there, and they're getting all these kids churned out. So if you have many more older siblings, what then does the quantity quality trade-off tell us about what you're likely to see among the kids with many more older siblings compared with kids who don't have many more older siblings? And the answer is, well, if higher family size for one, that alone would reduce the children's quality. Again, you know, all children have quality, but what we're talking about are things like mother's time spent on the child. And when there are 5 children, mom's time gets split 5 ways. We're talking about, you know, private preschool, for example, which costs money, and the more kids you have, the less you can afford to invest in each one. So that's an obvious one. The other thing that I probably should have written about here too is there's also birth order. And it turns out that kids who are further down in birth order end up usually with lesser outcomes than the kids who are higher up in birth order. And one of the wild things there is that if you look at the height of brothers, I take this to heart because I have an older brother. If you look at the height of brothers, the second brother and third brother, et cetera, is systematically lower on average than the height of the first brother. So the firstborn is taller when you look at brothers. And this is also true about my family. My older brother is taller than I am. Height is an index of health usually. And, you know, so he's got the longer end of the stick on that one, literally. Okay, so that's one part, is that family size is correlated with having an older dad. Also, so is birth order. And it turns out that moms had less education among these families with older dads. And that could be a story about family size, that the family might choose to have more children if the mother is less educated, which could reflect the value of time, for example. So if she has less education, her wage is lower. And so you would expect possibly for the family to have chosen more quantity. And it could also reflect a sort of debating. So that's what we had in mind at the time, that the mothers with less education might be less, might have less value on the marriage market rather, and so might also older dads might have less value on the marriage market compared to a mom with more education or a younger father, everything else equal. So it could be either one of those sorts of things. So this speaks to a very salient thing for now and forever. And if you've seen this in econometrics, this will be a bit more familiar. It leads to omitted variable bias if there is some other variable z, and so here the example might be mother's education, that is correlated with the x variable of interest. And if what you're doing is modeling your outcome, your left-hand side y variable as a function of an x variable and then a random noise term, that's what epsilon is, and then maybe there's an intercept term here, a. If you drop z, and z is important, so if mother's education is important for children's neurocognitive outcomes, if you drop z altogether, then your estimate of b, the marginal effect of paternal age, say, on the outcome will be biased. And it's biased because of the omitted variable. So that's a standard thing in econometrics. It's a standard thing in a lot of economics, for honestly. And it's also a very standard thing even today with the coronavirus. So you may have heard, if you've listened to any of the president's news conferences, you were guaranteed to have heard about this, that there's something out there that treats malaria called chloroquine, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, or maybe chloroquine or something. And a related derivative, hydroxychloroquine, have gained attention despite the WHO saying that there is no definitive evidence that they work. This is an omitted variable bias story because, and as we'll talk about more, with this drug treating coronavirus, there has been no control group to compare to. There's no way of disentangling whether it's the effect of this drug that may be positive versus anything else. And one of the big challenges here, and why not? So what the president has said is, well, why not try this? Well, the answer is you could have some serious side effects, liver damage and renal failure and things like that. It's not good. That's why not. And I don't know why he doesn't seem to know that, but he doesn't. So all we have to do is swap on the previous slide a few definitions of things. Suppose survival of coronavirus, that's our outcome variable here. Suppose it's associated with chloroquine, the X variable, but suppose it's also associated with something else. Well, if Z and X are correlated, and there are many worlds in which that could be true, then just comparing, or formally running a model if you like, but comparing those who received this treatment to people who didn't, it doesn't reveal a ton because of this problem of omitted variable bias. It could well be that there's something else that is negatively or positively associated with this. It could be that doctors who administer this stuff look at the individual and say, well, this person has a chance, so we have to give them this drug. Well, that's revealing that they seem to be more robust, or maybe they're younger. Any one of these things could be true. And so identifying some kind of average association with a treatment effect, an actual treatment effect of the drug is very premature unless there's some kind of control group. So that's the big problem here. If you can identify a control group, a group of individuals who are otherwise identical, so here they would have to have coronavirus and they would have to not receive the treatment of the drug. And then you get what's called an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, if you're actually able to do this. The problem is that you have to deny the treatment to the control group, and nobody's yet been able to really do that. So it's the same kind of thing. We've come a long ways here over the last several slides. My point was that understanding how there is selection in the marriage market, selection into marriage and all that, it's kind of part of the same story with understanding selection into control or treatment groups, generally speaking. It's the same deal with what we're grappling with the treatment for coronavirus. Okay, so let me stop my share and ask if there are questions. That's the last slide I've got for today. Next Thursday, we'll begin immigration. Any questions today? Nicole's raising her hand.
Can you clarify what you mean by marriage contracts?
What do I mean by marriage contracts? It's an agreement about what the marriage is going to look like, broadly speaking. So an agreement between the partners in a marriage. It probably sounds really weird because if you're like me, I don't know anybody who formally has a marriage contract. But you might imagine it being similar to like a prenuptial agreement, for example, that all the Hollywood stars seem to have, right? It's that kind of idea.
So it's not used to distinguish between people that like formally get married versus like living together?
Well, that's a really good question. I would not think of it as existing in one but not the other today. There clearly are differences between formally being married and just partnering but not being married. But you could have a covenant in either one of them. It's just part of the question is to what extent it's enforceable. So Becker's imagining a world in which the contract is fully enforceable. And his message is this Econ 101 message of if you have a market with enforceable contracts and full information, then the best thing happens for everybody. That's his bottom line. Other questions? Nicole?
I don't mean to belabor the point, but if it's relevant for the like red circles and the green boxes, why didn't you like divide the numbers in for the green boxes?
Oh yeah. So you mean like, yeah, divide them in half or something. Yeah. Yeah, I think we could do that. Yeah. I was pressed for time and I was struggling to understand it myself.
Can you reiterate just from what we will need to know on the exam for those particular sides?
The punchlines are that if markets are well functioning, then you're going to have good outcomes and people are going to figure out how to solve this problem, maximizing their well-being in a marriage market. Yeah, it's the broad brush kinds of things, the Econ 101 sorts of messages here. And you might think about, well, what does erode free markets or perfectly competitive markets? And there are things like asymmetric information, right? The Econ 101 sorts of things. Asymmetric information, unenforceability of contracts. And so a reasonable exam question might be, well, what is the difference between a marriage in front of your family and friends where you promise, to be married versus a partnership where you don't promise? And the answer is, well, there's presumably some degree of enforceability of a contract in the former. In the latter, not maybe obviously so much. It's not clear. So I think we're out of time. Last question for anybody? Okay. Thanks very much. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.